Good afternoon, and thank you for joining me as we go through Siegelvision's webinar entitled Humanizing Human Resources Communications. And how ironic is that there is even a need to discuss making communications aimed at employees and prospects more human. But it is a fact that we need to. We live in an increasingly complex world, not just our office world, our factory world, our store world, but our world in general. And we're filled and confronted by choices we can't make. And this unfortunately happens all too often at work in particular. In the field of HR, many employees are faced with analysis paralysis. For example, retirement plans, 401k plans, are filled with choices. This is an example of a plan that we feel is an example of faux or false simplicity. They've rolled up these many choices into 4 choices, but the 4 choices are named easy choice, guided choice, open choice, and annuity choice. But in fact, it's really more of a dilemma because behind each one of them are dozens of choices. How can you make so many selections? And particularly, research has shown people will not feel confident or comfortable with the choice they have made when they are confronted with too many choices. They always feel that, quote, the good one got away. There's a sweet spot around which advisors and researchers have largely agreed that no more than 15 to 20 investment options are suitable in a defined contribution plan. And that's if you count target date funds as one investment. As Brady Dahl, a retirement plan advisor, captured it when he said, if you're getting over 20, you're not getting any diversification benefits, and it starts getting too much for participants to handle. And that is certainly true. So even when it's something that is viewed by an employee as a benefit, as a good thing, the experience can be overwhelming and disconcerting. And then at a more micro level, in terms of the language, we're often confronted by language we can't decipher within the field of HR. HR is a particularly jargon-riddled field. It's a mixture of euphemisms, technological terms, terms that are used to make something sound more elaborate, more involved, more prestigious perhaps, than familiar. But the effect is terms such as retrenchment, hybrid cloud engagement, gig workers, even something as basic as joining a company is called onboarding. All of this makes things abstract, which need to be concrete, appealing, and simple. And at the level of prose and text, we find very often HR communications are particularly lifeless and devoid of humanity. An irony, given that we are in fact hiring humans, not robots. However, this sample job description, an actual one, is a perfect example of a job description that would not invite anyone to seek this employment. It is so devoid of specificity and humanity that it is absolutely lifeless. And when you dissect the text, you find out why that is. First, it begins with overly broad nouns. Control, function, control functions. Control functions, once again, sound robotic, not as though it's a task for a human. The repetition, they've tried to enliven that dead function with a verb, driving. In fact, they use driving 3 times. However, the repetition of driving makes me suspect that, in fact, it's going nowhere. And then the rest of the description is filled with complex yet meaningless terms. Radical digitization, streamlined digital governance approval processes, all culminating in an agile, I doubt it, operating model. And it's capped off with an undefined acronym, MRAs. The culmination here is that it makes it hard for someone to see themselves in this position or to see why they would want to feel passionate about a job described in such a lifeless, boring manner. So companies spend a lot of time on those job descriptions and even more time on job titles. But it's interesting what has happened with job titles. Would you put servant leader on your resume? Well, if you worked at one of these companies, that might be your title. 7-Eleven and Taco Bell, are they being unrealistic with their job titling? 7-Eleven calls employees servant leaders, and Taco Bell calls them champions. I would argue that both of them are on the fringes of reality. Servant leaders may be going too far, and champions may be going too far in the other direction when you're describing many service-oriented, low-paying jobs where people will feel that that is an abstraction that is trying perhaps to cast the job in a light different than the reality of what the tasks are that are involved. But does McDonald's achieve a better balance? They use the title crew member. That certainly is in line with its positioning that, quote, simpler is better. It's more descriptive and less aspirational. Another company, Zappos, has gone so far as to drift into meaningless and esoteric job titling. And that is a reflection of an even more esoteric description of their organization. Zappos flattened their organization and removed chain of command titling. This caused confusion and a large exodus of employees. They described their organization as a holacracy. Essentially, while that's certainly somewhat pretentious and unfamiliar to many, it had deeper issues because they likened themselves to a city and they ratified a constitution. An interesting metaphor. But that construct, that metaphor, was at odds with one of the company's core values, which was build a positive team and family spirit. I think part of the failure there in the titling was that cities and families differ. Families have very well-defined roles with very clear, predictable titling. We all know what it means in terms of relationship to be a mother, father, sister, brother, grandfather, cousin. That's not the same structure as a city. So those two may have caused confusion and, in fact, not achieved their ends. A much more successful flattened structure is evident at a company called Valve, a video game developer. As you can see on the cover of their handbook for new employees, they immediately suggest the notion of responsibility of the individual and their flattened organization, with the description, a fearless adventure in knowing what to do when no one's there telling you what to do. This idea is borne out as you go more deeply into the handbook. And they use the phrase, welcome to Flatland, emphasizing again this notion of self-reliance, self-motivation as the hallmarks of the company. And in fact, the handbook and their other human resource communications reflect that notion and that philosophy. Patron Spirits, in a completely different field, also hits the mark in an interesting way. I would say it's a great example of brand alignment. They describe themselves as maker of the world's finest tequila, and they celebrate on their website skilled humidors who possess specific acumen to, quote, uproot only those Weber blue agave with optimal sugar content. All of this language and description is in keeping with their mission, which they describe as a story of perfection. And perfection they are crediting to the skill of the farmers, elevating their social status, supporting the brand, and intriguing customers. It's a great alignment of showing respect for the employees as reflections of the brand and the brand as reflections of the qualities of their employees. Further on, they also, in their text, describe birthdays, free transportation, and worship, recognizing employees as people, as humans. They say that they offer top-level safety conditions, flexible work hours, free employee transportation. They take time to celebrate important life moments. And they even go so far as to say they have built a chapel at their distillery that is always open to employees for worship. They also use photography that shows their employees in a realistic setting of being in a field as opposed to in an office or a building. All of this comes together and culminates in a feeling of a company that is very aware of their employees, aligned with their employees, and respectful of their employees. All of that is outwardly facing communication. Of course, within the field of HR and other aspects of the businesses, there is too much data and too little context. If you are on the receiving end of reams of statistics, it can be very hard to decipher them without context. This is by no means an overly complicated chart, but it is one that is a good example of making a mountain out of a molehill. By having 4 mountain graphs, it's showing you drawing a very simple conclusion, but never drawing it for you. It never explicitly states the point here that unemployment rates are lowest for people with higher levels of education, and they have steadier levels. If it had said that, drawn the conclusion, even while still using the same graphic representation, it would have helped the reader to know whether or not they wanted to delve deeper or question that conclusion. And of course, this page is one page out of dozens or hundreds of pages of statistics. Then there's also the issue of instructions we can't follow. When we want to do the right thing, we want to know what the process is, can we? This is an example where there are too many factors and too many negations. This bulleted list manages to make abstract very familiar concepts. Any excessive geographical limitations associated with the on-call time, meaning do you have to be near or far from the job? Any on-premises living requirement, the number of calls and whether the frequency is unduly restrictive. They have managed to make very familiar things very abstract, to have 7 different criteria that have to be considered to decide if on-call time is compensable, another abstraction. And then they have used so many negatives that you have to unravel whether you are trying to compensate or not compensate. If non-exempt employees that they normally do while not on call, it is likely the time spent on call is not compensable. By the time you unravel all of that, you feel as though you have solved a riddle. So there's an opportunity to clarify many work-related topics. We touched very lightly on the onboarding process. That is certainly the chance to make a first impression and is very often one that is filled with pages of paperwork, handbooks, manuals, forms, descriptions of benefits, hundreds sometimes of pages, either in print or online, when in fact more should be done with videos, real employees describing their jobs, customized summary sheets, things that are specific, that are human, and that allow people to ask real-world questions. There's a desperate need to train HR professionals to write in plain language, to not reward them for making something more complicated, but rewarding them for simplifying, and reducing unproductive legalese, like the example I just showed you, where someone's trying to follow the instruction to determine the compensation. Companies would do themselves a great service by writing job descriptions that actually connect with the kinds of applicants they seek. Clarifying employee benefits would help specific audiences realize the value of those benefits. An annual customized online statement that shows the dollar value of specific benefits in addition to wages and more traditional compensation, as well as benchmarks to show how that compares to other industry norms or similar job classifications, can be quite powerful in making employees understand the true benefit of their compensation. And conveying policies in actionable, meaningful ways. And this last point is one that I think is particularly critical regarding policies surrounding cybersecurity. This is an area that companies are extremely concerned about, and realistically so, but it's particularly confusing and intimidating. In all industries, people are at risk of breaches of security, either of data or equipment. And in these cases, people rarely, although well-intentioned, know actually how to protect the company's information and technology. The opportunity to clarify cybersecurity is not to produce another handbook, another written policy, more pages of legalese, but it needs to be customized information by job function with the ability to test or measure understanding of the actual policies, what is being asked of people and how it applies in the real world in a way that they can act on it. It's not logical to offer the same information to the head of IT in a bank and to a bank teller and to someone in the HR department. Each of them performs different functions, has different exposure and needs to understand what it means on a day-to-day basis to protect the company's information. In fact, I've spent my entire career concentrating on the issue of simplifying all kinds of information for all industries. In fact, I co-authored a book with the CEO of Siegelvision entitled Simple: Conquering the Crisis of Complexity. And what we realized when we wrote the book was that in all of the work that we have tackled, breakthrough simplicity is the result of three key principles: empathy, distillation, and clarity. And those three, in that order, lead to breakthrough simplicity. And in fact, that's true when we worked with the IRS on the first easy tax form, when we worked on the first simplified loan note for Citibank, the first investor-friendly Wall Street account statement, and even the simplified auto and home insurance policy for Chubb. Each of these was a first. Since then, we have applied these techniques over and over in digital as well as print and found that those three principles are always at work. In a clarity blueprint, we need to begin by asking, are we communicating in the right way, at the right time, with the right information? A question of the medium, the timing, and the content. Considering the quantity and nature of interactions is important. Understanding where the content authors lie, how many of them there are, and what they are producing will give you a sense of the weight that bears down on any particular customer or member. In these circumstances, each author may not realize the ripple effect as these pieces accumulate for the recipient. It's also important to analyze the current methods of communication. Is information delivered via email, in print, as a phone call, on screen, through a website, through a text message? All of those media will have an effect on the recipient and needs to be tailored to the information preferences of customers. We also analyze current processes. When is the information being generated? In this example, it's a business-to-business example. But when is it being generated? How often? Where is it stored? Because some of those insights will affect what can be done to reconstruct the information. And then an overall reduction in the quantity of information. For one Wall Street firm, we looked at multiple agreements and disclosures for their brokerage accounts and found we could reduce the quantity of information by 75% because of redundancies across these documents. By reducing and winnowing down the quantity of information, we're already achieving a measure of simplicity in the form of brevity and helping people to interact with less information and hopefully more specific information. In some cases, though, it's creating entirely new experiences, not just new communications that are critical. And you need to consider whether the interactions are clear. Are they in plain language? Do they use intuitive information design? Are they credible? Is it believable coming from your specific organization at this time? Have you just had bad press? Have you just been fined? Have you just had a major layoff? The context will also affect the authenticity of the information. And is it compelling? Does it help you attract and engage all audiences? Information may be clear, but it can also be lifeless when it's clear. It needs to be attractive and engaging. And it's important to follow the reader's pathway, to understand what it is you're asking of them. In this example, there are 42 steps across 10 pages of a letter. And some of those steps take the reader outside the document. It's unrealistic. When you do this kind of mapping, you realize immediately that this is beyond the reality of what the reader will be able to absorb or do. When we worked with the IRS on correspondence, we realized that there actually were very clear and few purposes behind the letters and notices. You owe the IRS money, the IRS owes you money, or the IRS is providing you with information, or vice versa. Those pathways or channels became the underpinning, and the purpose of the communication drove much of the content and structure. And in this case, the outcome was the experience that we were seeking. They described the letters as more human, less frightening, elegant with simplicity. And it's important to measure success and to set those metrics before you create the quote afters, the new information, so that you can measure a benchmark of what the existing is and what the future state will be. In one case for an insurance company, the measures were reduction in customer service calls, savings in print and postage, improved retention of canceled policies, and an increase in the number of renewals. All valid metrics, many other metrics that can be employed, but they were specific metrics, so they knew how they had moved the needle. What we're talking about is how do you go from here, to a more digital, simpler, faster, more data-driven, more online experience in many cases. We believe that complexity is a thief that must be apprehended. It robs us of time, patience, understanding, money, and optimism, both as business people, as employees, and as consumers. Thank you for joining me today. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to contact me or Siegelvision at our website. And as you see here is my contact information. We are based in New York City, and we look forward to hearing from you and or seeing more simplified experiences within your companies. Thank you.